And so welcome to the Chamber web chat for this Friday. I'm delighted to welcome the Chief Minister of Guernsey, Gavin has joined us there. Good to have you with us, Gavin. Thank you for joining us all the way from Guernsey. It's our first Guernsey visitor to the web chat, so great to have you with us.
Well, delighted to be with you, and obviously in an era when we can't travel in person, this will have to suffice.
It will, until the next time we shall meet. And also joining us, the President of the Jersey Chamber of Commerce, Jennifer Carnegie. Jennifer, good to have you with us. 2 weeks running for you. And obviously this is the first anniversary of your year as the first year as Chamber President. So we trust things are going well for you.
Thanks, Murray. I think other people are probably better judges of whether it's going well or not, but I think we're doing okay. Thank you.
Right. Let's get ourselves underway. We've got plenty of questions that have been coming in, and I know that we've had plenty of people joining us as well. And I think there's almost 200 people registered to watch the webinar. So welcome along. It's good to have you.
Great.
And there is a Q&A box at the bottom there, which if you send that through to me, then we'll see what questions that we can get through. I'm going to, for the sake of you being in Guernsey and Guernsey's Chief Minister, you're comfortable with me calling you Gavin before we...
Of course, yeah, of course.
Excellent. Just call me Gavin, fine. Gavin, first of all, let's just look at this crisis that we've been through and the management of such a crisis. And that's where I wanted to really look from today. When you look at the 8-9 weeks of front-end management here, do you have time to assess yourself and assess how you think you've done?
That's a very good question. I think probably a bit like the response to Jennifer's question. It's probably for others to do rather than oneself. I mean, I think what we have tried to do quite early on in the process is say we need to capture lessons as we go along. Because at some point, inevitably and rightly, there will need to be a post-mortem, and we will need to learn lessons for the next crisis, and that we will need to feed that in. And the best way to do that is to capture it as we go along. So that, I think, is one of our challenges, because, of course, one's recollection 3, 6, 9 months down the line is going to be rather different from in the moment. So, but no, it's an interesting experience.
I'm assuming that there's someone there capturing that as it's going along, because it's very easy to just be rolling with the momentum of it and hand-to-hand fighting and then forgetting that you've got to capture it.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, actually, I think government is spectacularly well set up, actually, to manage this kind of thing in terms of its structure and its thinking. I think it's, organisationally, its preparedness for dealing with kind of crisis, and as you'd hope and expect, of course. I mean, it's pleasing that it's responded well to the crisis, but no, absolutely, to have a team of people around who are able to capture what needs to be captured is critical.
We'll come to talk about that team, because I suspect you're going to talk about the team that you have around you. Jennifer, in terms of crisis management, I mean, it is a team effort, isn't it?
I think it most definitely is. I think, the key thing from a leadership point of view during a crisis is it's not your job to come up with all the great ideas. It's your job to facilitate the people around you to come up with those ideas with you and to help you work out the problem that you're trying to solve, and then the routes to solve it. And the more that you can engage with stakeholders, the more that you can gather intelligence, the more that you can understand the context in which you're operating, the more resilient I think your planning will be. And, communication and consultation with people to get that intelligence is absolutely critical, bearing in mind that you'll probably never have enough time or never have enough resource to gather all the intelligence that you need. But the more you can get, the more inputs you can get, the better. And use people around you that you trust, but people that will also challenge you. It's no point in surrounding yourself with people, I think, Gavin will know this better than many, don't surround yourself with people who are just going to agree with you. You want people to challenge you up front before you go out to public with things, so you've covered as many bases as you can.
Gavin, I'm going to put that back to you. In terms of challenge, has there been enough challenge? Have you questions asked?
Yeah, I mean, it is a very good point that Jennifer makes, the need to challenge, and certainly in the forums that I've been involved with, particularly, of course, the Civil Contingencies Authority, which is the the lead, to being the one that's taking the lead in the Guernsey structure, I've certainly sought to ensure that we can try and provide challenge. It's actually quite hard at a technical level when you're talking about some of this public health advice, which is obviously scientifically based. And I've sought to ensure that there is enough challenge within that public health team, so that we aren't just the products of groupthink. In a way, that was less of an issue going into the crisis than it's been coming out. I think coming out, everything becomes much more nuanced, and actually it's recognised that there aren't black and white answers, and it is a question. Ultimately, these are subjective political decisions, and therefore, all that the advisors can do in that case is provide advice. But ultimately, the politicians do have to make a political decision, and in a way that it's probably a better reversion to type, because then you can then get political challenge into the system, and that's something that we've tried to do in the last few weeks, is build more political input to the decision making. So that there is greater scrutiny and challenge before decisions are made. But it's been one of the toughest things, I think, just because of the speed. Going back to Jennifer's point about the need to get input, certainly in the very early stages, that was almost impossible because of the speed at which decisions needed to be made if we weren't going to lose critical, valuable time.
Jennifer.
I think one of the things that I've observed, Gavin, that you've done in your communications, which I think is great, and I think leaders of organisations that are effective in crises do this, is that they realise that bad decisions are inevitable, and to be upfront and honest about that. Obviously, you try not to make them, and with the benefit of hindsight, but they are to be expected. I think what you've shown is that you make decisions, you move on, and then you correct and adjust as you go. So you're actually responding minute by minute to the crisis and not being paralysed by the fear of making a decision just in case it's wrong. And I think there's a lot that businesses can take away from that.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. That actually governments around the world clearly have suffered a lack of trust in them from their publics, and Guernsey's government has been no different to any others in that. And I think building that trust through this crisis has been absolutely critical. And I would agree with you that central to that was quite early in the process actually saying, we don't have all the answers, that we've never done this before, we haven't got a playbook that we're working to, we will make mistakes. We hope that broadly we're making the right decisions. It might be a few days early, it might be a few days late. And I think that level of openness and honesty with the public was what really helped build trust and confidence, that because everybody recognised this was such an unusual phenomenon that nobody had experienced. Nobody could reasonably be expected to say they have all the answers. And of course, those political leaders around the world who have sought to do that, have largely ended up being, ridiculed as a result, because the reality is they can't possibly have all the answers. So I think that's it. In normal political times, that capacity to make mistakes and move on is quite restricted in the political environment. And Murray will know this from his time in politics, because unlike a business, because you're under constant public and media scrutiny, the expectation is you won't make mistakes, because if you make mistakes, ultimately it's going to cost money and it's going to cost the taxpayer, and therefore it is your job not to make mistakes. And that's ultimately, of course, what often causes government to move quite slowly, because it's constantly taking a very cautious approach. So I think in a way, ironically perhaps, that this crisis liberates the politicians from all of those normal constraints in a way that, the reality is it's not sustainable in the long term as a way of managing government. But in a crisis, it's absolutely critical. I would agree with you, Joe.
What's interesting, of course, Gavin, is that you not only have the liberation of that, because mistakes are bound to happen and you're learning as you go, but you're also not just talking about things that cost money, but things that cost lives as well. So there is pressure in a completely different way than probably most chief ministers will ever experience. Making decisions that are going to cost lives doesn't come up very often.
No, thankfully.
Yeah.
And clearly it's not a role that any of us either expect to be in or particularly want to be in. It just happens to be on your watch, as it were. But no, I think that the reality of that your decisions have the potential to have that impact, I think is a very real burden which you have to take into account in making decisions.
Plenty of questions coming in, as you might expect, on this, and welcome to everyone who's joined us on the Chamber web chat on this Friday afternoon. Gavin St. Pier, who's the Chief Minister of Guernsey, for the comfort of us chatting, is Gavin today, and Jennifer is the President of the Jersey Chamber of Commerce. The questions come in for you, Chief Minister. How do you, or have you, measured and modelled the economic impact of your decisions as you've made them? And how would you describe the likely long-term economic impact of your approach in Guernsey?
Oh, very, very good question. I think the honest answer is at the outset, no. This was first and foremost a public health crisis, and certainly the initial early data responses was treating it a public health crisis and dealing with the consequences afterwards. So the modelling, I mean, it began quite early, obviously, as it was quite obvious it was going to have an economic impact. We needed to understand that and understand the impact on government cash flows and public finances and liquidity and all those things. So, but that definitely was the second order set of questions. And that modelling has continued. I think it's become it's been finessed, and obviously the quality of the data improves. I mean, our central assumption remains a fairly high hit to GDP this year, even with a return, to much of the domestic economy with effect from tomorrow here. Clearly a lot of economic damage has been done. In terms of the long term, I think it is still quite difficult at this stage even to look to the horizons. Clearly, the strength of financial services and its ability to largely trade through is clearly a major strength to the economy, but equally one would expect, as it often does, as financial services providers will have a lag to any recession that appears in the UK or further afield. So I think the reasonable expectation is there will be a knock-on impact. The other question that we're still working on is the extent to which our recovery strategy will accelerate our growth and back to above trend, or indeed above trend. I think there are some real strategic opportunities that come out of any crisis, including this one. The question is whether we're able to capture and exploit those and do it in a timely manner. If the modelling at the moment assumes that if we do not take any recovery action, in other words, we simply take the hit and then life sort of drifts back to normal, we would not return to our pre-COVID GDP until 2027. So that gives you a scale of the impact. So in other words, we're firmly of the view that we need to take some action if we're not to experience that event.
Jennifer's going to come in at this point. I could tell from the look on your face you were just thinking of something.
Well, no, I completely understand what Gavin's saying and completely agree. And I think just the point about strategy, I mean, for me, practicalities, if you look at what businesses need to consider when there's a crisis going on, is the key thing, as I've mentioned already, understand the problem that you're trying to solve, which we've talked about, understand your people, but then develop your plan to deal with it. And I think what you've done is you've developed your plan, and from what we can see remotely here is that you've shared those plans with people and got built up confidence in those plans. And I think that's a message for business, that your plan is about laying out what you're going to do about the problem, presenting all the options available, evaluating them, realise that it's quite often choosing the best of a load of bad choices, but providing that balance, and then picking one, being bold, acting on it and driving it through, and having the courage of your convictions when you do that. Know that you might not be right, but you've done enough analysis, or you've got enough confidence in the strategy that you've set out to proceed.
In terms of the Guernsey Together, I'm just going to take that a stage further. Guernsey Together is something that we've seen a great deal of from the media coverage and from, if you like, the other island. How important has that been? Because you've referenced it many, many times, that this is about a collective effort by the island.
Yes, I think one of the things that I hadn't appreciated going into the crisis, really because my head was down, focused on the problem, and certainly for the first 3 weeks, I'm just sort of getting slightly off at a tangent in addressing the question, but I quite literally had no capacity whatsoever to take any information in from outside beyond that which I needed to manage the immediate sets of decisions. And as a result of that, what I hadn't really appreciated was the scale of community shock that was being experienced. You know, the whole community was experiencing this, you know, had this emotional experience. You know, perhaps say completely understandable, but because I was focused on the immediate challenge and because I had more information than most people, I hadn't really appreciated that. And recognizing that on that spectrum, you've got some in the community who are living in a state of phobia and real state of fear for themselves and their families and their loved ones and their friends, to those who feel that it's a bad case of the flu, and most of us somewhere on the spectrum in between. And so I think the Guernsey Together piece has been really critical to trying to cover that wide spectrum and saying, okay, wherever you are in that, we're all having the same experience, albeit to a slightly different degree. So yes, if you haven't been furloughed and you're still in your job, but you're working at home, you're having a slightly different experience to somebody else. But nonetheless, we are all having a very real reaction to this event. And I think that seeking to bind the community together in a way that understanding the importance of the public health messages and adherence to them, I think has been critical. And I think in terms of maintaining morale, but also it comes back to that maintaining confidence. I think that confidence in government's decision making, that as we said earlier, irrespective of whether mistakes may be made, everybody is actually, you know, working in good faith. I think has helped. And again, I believe, truly believe that will help in our recovery as well. So long as the longer we can maintain that sense of togetherness. And it's harder because people are having different experiences coming out than they were going in. But I think that will help us coming out.
Questions coming in. As a director of a business in Guernsey, see, we are Channel Island today, I think you've excelled as your role as the First Minister, as the Chief Minister, showing good leadership and communication skills. So says Gordon. Delighted that most business can resume from tomorrow, but do you feel your greatest challenge ahead is to open borders? Is that your greatest challenge, do you think?
Yeah, undoubtedly. And I think we've recognised and acknowledged that actually it is essential that we reconnect with the outside world. We recognise that it is impossible to remain completely isolated until there is a vaccine, not least before we re-engage with the outside world. The challenge is when and how. And I think the concern at the moment really is that clearly the main transport connection is to the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has one of the highest prevalence rates within Europe, so it's not a particularly attractive place to be connecting to right now. So I think the key to reconnecting will be the UK, the UK's rate of infection coming down, albeit that we're clearly never going to be able to eliminate all risk, but it'll be easier to mitigate and manage. So, but not just for economic reasons. I think the reality is that the visitor economy is not going to be in a good place for us this year. I think much of the financial services sector is probably not going to really want to be travelling anyway in either direction, so I don't think that's a major factor. But for social, family reasons, whether it's students, whether it's visiting family, that is an important part of the mental well-being of the community as well. So we do need to reconnect, but I do think it's going to be a little while yet before we're in a position to do so safely.
Interesting. Jennifer, I know you have a question or two for Gavin as well. So
I do have a couple of questions, and I think one thing that comes up a lot from a business point of view when you're talking about dealing with a crisis is resilience. And I think there is a temptation in some quarters to believe that you can list all the risks that, that you might be exposed to, and you can prepare a mitigation plan to deal with it and then think that you've nailed it. Actually, you're actually trying to spirit away any uncertainty. And for me, resilience is about how you deal with uncertainty. So just doing risk analysis doesn't necessarily prepare you for that. Guernsey's handling of the whole COVID crisis has been recognised by lots and lots of people in Guernsey and outside as being successful. But has it exposed any lack of resilience that you're prepared to talk about in this forum, in your organisation? And what have you done about it? Because this is something that business leaders grapple with a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose as a politician, the concern is around the governance of decision making, which is in a democratic environment. How do you ensure that decisions are made that you can make robust decisions that can be adhered to and delivered, but nonetheless they are appropriately subject to scrutiny in an appropriate fashion. And I think that's a constant tension, I guess, in any government environment, particularly one in crisis. And I think what we have realised is that our system of government, our emergency authority that was set up a few years ago, I think has been very resilient. It's done what it was expected to do in terms of identifying a crisis or an emergency within the terms of the law, and being able to deliver the framework that enabled the response to happen on the ground. So all well and good, tick in box. The weakness, I think, is probably that it was in its design. It was never assumed that the crisis would ever be more than a few days or a few weeks. So it probably envisaging a major weather event or the power station being knocked out for a few days, or those sorts of things. And I think that the ability to mesh our emergency decision making with our normal government is probably the biggest challenge we have in terms of our resilience. Really, ultimately, that's really what we're talking about. To respond to, and particularly to handle the recovery. So I think that's one of the lessons, going back to where we started this conversation, that will need to be picked up and dealt with, so that if in the future we hit a longer term crisis of this nature, we have a more robust system of governance that enables us to manage our way through.
So just following on from that then, if I may, Murray, you talked a lot in the media, and it's been talked about in the UK, and it's been mentioned here about a second wave.
Yes.
Given that we know what to expect now, are you going to use a similar kind of approach going into a second wave, or is there anything that you are changing as a result of what you've learned so far? Yeah,
very good question. I mean, I think the answer is that we've all the planning for the second wave is almost an operational response at this point, in terms of the risks are better understood in terms of where it's going to come from and how it could happen, and therefore going back again to the need to how do you mitigate those. A lot of that is around your resourcing on testing capacity and all of those things. So that's in essence and PPE and all those things. So a lot of it becomes a planning the right operational response. So I don't think we have. But we haven't, and actually it's a sufficiently good challenge. I will need to go away and think about that, actually, as to whether we ought to be getting ourselves in gear so that we have a possibly a different governance response. So yeah, the answer is to your question is no, but it's a good challenge. So I'll need to think about that one. Thank you.
I'm glad good of you to add something for Gavin to think about. I've got two questions that are fairly can be answered probably with one set of answers. From Barry, in a complex situation like a pandemic, what protocols do you follow to ensure that you balance all of the competing needs? And there are obviously a lot of those. And another question that's come in that says, how are you balancing the need to make decisions that will encourage economic recovery with the uncertainty over the length and severity of the economic crisis. So there's, you're always stuck between a rock and a hard place. You almost go back to the health and the economic on the way up of this, and probably recovery on the way down.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of hinted at it before, was that the way we seek to balance it, the way we are seeking to balance it, is to have greater input into some of that decision making. So greater political input, and therefore buy-in, I guess, to ultimately to try and get that balance. And it is a balance, and that comes back to the subjective political decision. And again, let's touch on one example of that Murray, that you asked earlier, which is about travel and reopening the borders. Clearly that has an economic consequence, and it has potentially a public health consequence and risk attached to it. How do we weigh those two? And I think it's, yes, going back to Jennifer's point, is that you can spend a lot of time on doing a lot of modelling and putting a lot of data into all these things, but ultimately it's going to come down to a subjective decision that needs to be made, and that really just requires input from I think Jennifer made the point earlier as well, also a broad range of people, so that you can make the best judgment you can. And I think that's the approach we're taking in relation to trying to balance the economy and the public health issue. But I think also the approach very much was, if we can get on top of the thing that will most help the economy is getting control of the public health crisis. So it's, in that sense, it's not a direct trade-off. It's not one or the other. Actually, you're trying to have both, and by you're more likely to, you will do less damage to the economy if you can sort the public health crisis out.
I think, Gavin, in terms of the Chamber of Commerce, we represent 600 businesses on the island, 30,000 employees. And building on what you said there, public sector is often suspicious of business or doesn't necessarily understand how it works. And we believe that we have a role from a chamber point of view to represent those businesses, to influence and shape what's happening now, the help and support that government is giving to businesses, and also into the future, especially at such a critical time. What tips do you have as the Chief Minister in Guernsey? What tips can you share with us on how businesses can effectively engage with government and really get their voices heard?
I mean, I would, yeah. I mean, you're right. It is it's very important that government hears the voice of business, and my experience in Guernsey is that needs to come from a myriad of different sources. I think the Chamber and other representative bodies are but one voice, and I think there is a danger also, coming back to the sort of the group thing that actually government shouldn't just be regarding whatever your governance structure is, the Chamber or the Council of Chamber or whatever it is, your executive group, as necessarily speaking for the interests of all business. Because yes, you're seeking to do that, but ultimately, again, you will be filtering it through your own lenses. So, I mean, the approach we take very much is maintaining direct contact with all the business organisations that we have here, but also reaching out to and encouraging contact with and from individual businesses as well, and that sort of helps provide a temperature check, really, of different views and opinions. So I don't think there's a magic to it, really. I think it does come down to creating there has to be a willingness and an openness, clearly, to be seeking that input, and then it's about creating the capacity and to enable those voices to be heard, and clearly some of that will need to be done at a political level, and some of it will need to be done through the senior civil servants. That's the approach.
So how do you do that specifically with business in Guernsey? How do you make sure that you're confident that you're hearing what business and people who've got a vested interest in the knowledge of the economy are saying?
Well, through regular dialogue. So I mean, we will be having either myself or often the vice president for my committee will be having regular meetings with them all, and to have that opportunity to be heard. And yeah, it's getting the different business groups expressing either the same view or the same view in a different way. I think it helps triangulate whether it is a single view or otherwise. But no, I think it comes back to the responsibility on government. I think is to, in my view, is to create the A, it needs to be willing to listen, and B, it needs to create the opportunity and the capacity to have those conversations. And that is purely a resource issue of time and making the time.
Great, thank you.
We're over halfway through. Doesn't time fly when you're having fun? And we've got plenty of questions.
Halfway through the crisis or halfway through the webinar?
I'll let you answer that one if you want. Are we halfway through? You've got a big enough mug of tea to go for the second half. That's for certain.
Yeah, well, I'm nearly done actually. But.
Yeah, well, get a refill. There's more to come.
Okay.
Question from Andrew, and you know, I want to say at the outset that the point of this was to get your understanding of crisis management and get your thoughts on this, not to compare Jersey and Guernsey. And you know, we've said that all the way along. There are no right answers; they're just different routes. And this question from Andrew, I think, is reasonable. With the stated commitment from both Jersey and Guernsey to work closer together, what's prevented closer working in this scenario? And will there be opportunities to work closer together in a second wave should we get one? Relevant question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair question. I mean, certainly, just as a sort of opener, I mean, you're right. There isn't a right or a wrong, and I've certainly would never seek to comment on what another jurisdiction is or isn't doing. I think one of the big surprises about this crisis for me is the absence of any kind of global response or global leadership. You kind of imagine that the biggest public health crisis, and ultimately potentially the biggest economic shock biggest public health crisis in 100 years and the biggest economic shock in 70, 80, would lead to a global response, and it hasn't. So, you know, literally every country and jurisdiction has been left to do its own thing, which I don't think is ideal at all. I mean, in terms of Jersey and Guernsey cooperation on this, again, I think there is perhaps more than people imagine. There's a lot of dialogue that goes on behind the scenes, particularly at the public health level, between the experts, sharing information, sharing data, sharing experience. At a political level, I mean, I speak to my opposite number at least twice a week, and sometimes more in various other fora that come up. So there's a good exchange of information. So we are, you know, seeking to understand what each island is doing and why. In terms of and indeed kicking around whether there's more we can be doing, whether there is more information that can be shared. So you know, if with the benefit of hindsight and more time and more planning, could we have done more together in you know, developing a single response? Possibly, I don't know. I think that's you know, that's something that we can you know, again consider in a post-crisis analysis possibly. But I think it's the responsibility ultimately for each. Going back to the first part, preamble to my response, is each government has got to make what it thinks are the right decisions at the time for the populations for which it's responsible, and that's the higher priority than necessarily cooperating with anybody else. Would be my view, because that ultimately comes back to gender. I think, sorry, your point, Murray, about ultimately you're talking potentially about people's lives. So.
Actually, there's a really, really good question that came in a lot earlier for this one, and I wanted to make sure that we gave this some airtime as well, because it relates to this. And it actually sort of says that, you know, whilst not wishing to validate or refute the personal response of Deputy Peter Fairbrush, and we'll leave those there, it is true that Jersey and Guernsey have very different political decision-making structures. Guernsey's got a committee system, arguably, you could argue that decentralizes political decision-making, compared to Jersey's ministerial model. Now, it could be assumed to make decision-making more difficult in a crisis, so something you appear to have overcome in judging your positive reviews and the action of your government. So, reflecting on that experience and the key success factors, how important is the structure of decision-making to make that, and how much of it is a personal element of political leadership, and then how much of it is trust in government?
I mean, there's several questions in there on that,
Yeah.
and it's a good and challenging question. I think the compare and contrast of Guernsey and Jersey's system of government and how they manage this crisis in governance terms, not in policy terms. Yes, we've got the Civil Contingencies Authority, you've got your Emergency Council or whatever, and then you've got the Council of Ministers, and I don't really know how they all interact, and I don't need to know. And equally, I think it's the same if you think about it from the public's perspective. Whether it's the Jersey or the Guernsey public, they're not remotely interested either. They couldn't give a monkeys about how the Civil Contingencies Authority interacts with the Committee for Home Affairs or the Committee for Health and Social Care. All they want to know is that decisions are being made and the leadership is being provided. So I think, for me, recognising that quite early on was critical. Actually, the minutiae of systems of government and governance is of very little consequence to a very worried and emotionally shocked public. I've always had the view that systems of government, which is a perennial debate in Guernsey, as I'm sure it is in Jersey, is interesting to those who are immersed in the business of politics. But ultimately, it doesn't really make that much difference. It's ultimately systems of government are less important than the people who are occupying whatever that system is, who need to make the decisions. That, I think, is probably going back, if you use the terms in the question, critical success factor. I think that probably is more important. Is the individual decision makers and providing that personal and determined leadership. I think that has to be a more relevant than how the decision is made.
Well, government's navel gazing, surely not. Never let them be accused. David's got a really interesting question here. This situation was very much time pressured, which drove the clear focus on decision making. So you're in the situation and you've got to make a decision. Would you like to see government decision making in future be strictly time bound in order to continue that focus? Because actually it's forced you to make quick decisions as opposed to deliberating forever over them. Yeah,
I mean, it's again, it's a logical challenge to make. I suppose the question is how sustainable that would really be in a non-crisis environment. So, let's pick a sort of perennial political topic in either island. I don't know. Let's building a hospital or extending a runway, for example. These things that go round and round. Would the quality of the decision be any better if it could be made more quickly? Would it be any more sustainable? Would that decision be any more sustainable or deliverable if it was made more quickly? I don't really know. I think it's ultimately, with some of these big decisions which are not time critical. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter whether you decide to extend a runway this month or next month. The world isn't going to stop turning if you haven't made that decision.
Are you still having that debate?
I think so. Ultimately, that means that you that I suppose that if the pressure is off in that sense, the only way you're going to be able to carry decisions through is with sufficient will and support from the community. So that then becomes a comms issue in terms of convincing the community that it is or enough of the community that a given decision is the right decision. And sometimes that does take time, to be able to shift the tanker from in a few degrees to left or right, but actually convincing people this is the right time to make this decision. So, I understand the premise behind the question, but I'm not sure that it's it's terribly practical in a normal, non-urgent environment. And I think this is one of the distinctions probably between government and business. Those of us that come into government from outside often dream and imagine that some of these decisions could be made more quickly, and why can't they be? And what we forget until you've experienced it is that impact of the public sentiment, public opinion, as expressed through social media, as expressed through the media, as expressed through the desire for money not to be wasted on decisions which have to change because they're mistakes in a way that you wouldn't be accountable for if you made that decision in business. And I think that is one of the distinctions. That's why government is not the same as business in some senses.
Jennifer, question from you, and I'm sure you've got some.
Yeah, I'm looking at the questions on the floor actually, and there's an interesting one that's come in from John Shenton, who's our Vice President here. And he says, no one quite knows what the end of this is going to look like. What would a successful conclusion look like for Guernsey, and how long are you expecting recovery to take?
Oh, I want to replace that cup of tea with a crystal ball, I think. Yeah, good question. What does success look like? I think success looks like a community which is stronger coming out than going in. By which I mean, I think it has taken the opportunity to seize the strategic opportunities that come out of any crisis. The old adage, "Don't waste a good crisis." And I think the responsibility to try and secure those is critical. So for us, that's things like the reform of the public service on the back of this kind of event, the reality, the learning that we can do things differently, whether we can reposition some of our economy and the movement and tying it into the need to reposition anyway as part of climate change and decarbonisation. So there are lots of things that I think we could do as part of our recovery, and if we seize those opportunities, then we will actually emerge stronger than we were without the crisis. That to me would be success.
And so when is the time to seize those longer term opportunities? Is it when you're in the thick of the fight at the moment, as we are with COVID, or is it further down the line?
I'm always one to believe to seize carpe diem, seize the day, take every opportunity you can, would be my view. I think, and again, I mean, this is I'm sure is common experience in Jersey. I think the realization that people have had of they have enjoyed some of the quieter times and the quieter that came from the early stages of lockdown, and there is a desire to try and lock some of that into our future way of living here. So I think a small example of that is a decision we've made today in relation to how we will pilot closing our seafront to help improve the environment for people at the weekends and get people enjoying that fantastic view that we have on our seafront. It's a tiny example, but it's let's not wait 6 months to have that debate, because in 6 months people have forgotten what it was like, and you'll be back to all the same arguments. So let's just do it now, see how it works out, and then if everybody likes it, well, then we just push on and get on with it. Mm-hmm. So that may be a personal instinctive view that don't wait. If you see an opportunity, try and take it now.
And one of the things that's talked about a lot, and particularly Mental Health Week last week, people talking about their own health and well-being, and I wanted to ask you about that, but Jack sent in a question here which I think is relevant. How have you found your own well-being during this period, and what strategies do you have for taking care of yourself as a leader in such a stressful time?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one I have been asked before. I think it's I mean, it's certainly in the early stages, very, very long days, 17, 18-hour days, I suppose, for about 3 weeks. So, yeah, I mean, for me, anchoring around family is clearly been critical. And I think actually again, like many people, I think one of the completely unexpected bonuses was the fact that suddenly all my family were around me, because in fact, all three of my children were off island, and suddenly they were all back, and back for an extended period, whether they like it or not. So that I think has has been an unexpected upside and has helped to have family. For me personally, the way I cope with stress is I create space in the day and for make sure I take some exercise every day. That really helps my mental well-being. I'm definitely more stressed at the end of the day if I haven't done that. And I think the third thing that I did that has helped is very early on in the crisis, I shed. I sort of rejigged my portfolio of responsibilities as the president of the Policy and Resources Committee. I asked other members of the committee to take on chunks of the role that I would have regarded as normal for me. And indeed, I haven't sought to reclaim those. So that is a way of spreading the burden and not trying to do everything. So those would be the strategies I've adopted during this crisis.
Great.
Quite interesting, because I wanted to bring team into this, Gavin, and a question actually from James, who says, how did you get the team on board with a radical change, if you like, to the leadership style and the role which has been required in this crisis? And I suspect that's wrapped very much up in that answer. But I wanted to bring your team in there, because that team has brought people to light that we never saw before. Your medical officer for health, Dr. Brink, your chief executive. There have been some people there that I guess you surround yourself almost with a war office to fight this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the team obviously is much broader than the public face that most people have become familiar with through the comms strategy we've adopted. I mean, I think and I think one of the things that I am most proud of actually is the team response. The public service leadership and has the structure is well set up to be able to sort of devolve some of that decision making and preparedness. It has been managed, has been exemplary, and I'm very proud of them for that.
I have to say, Gavin, we froze for a moment.
I mean, we took a decision quite early on that in comms, and again, this kind of comparing. Oh, I'm sorry. Hear me?
We can hear you now. Yeah, you're back.
Okay, good. So we're speaking with pride about the team, but I won't repeat that. I think we took a decision quite early on that in our comms strategy we would use the same people, and that was a conscious decision to create a consistent message, not just as well. And so we felt it was important to use the same people. So that's why we've presented the same people each week, and that was I think it was proved to be the right decision. But I think in terms of the underlying question, bringing people on board, I mean, I think the scale of the crisis was one that became fairly apparent quite quickly, and I think the realization that decisions just needed to be made. In a sense, I think we were given the latitude to get on with the decisions that were required early in the crisis without too much, without causing too much stress to anyone else. So I think in a way, the team was allowed to come together and get on with responding, which again, in a way, might not always be possible in a normal crisis.
There is a whole pile of questions. We're in the last 10 minutes of the Chamber web chat, which we've still got 100 or so people watching us. In fact, it's gone up since we've been watching, and so thank you very much indeed to everyone who's watching. Sponsored, by the way, and I should mention this, by Grant Thornton. Thank you to them for this as well. And a question that's just come in, which is about, do you have a roadmap in your mind for that road to recovery? We've talked about recovering. I know we've mentioned what good looks like, but is there a roadmap that you have already set, or is it still fairly flexible?
No, I mean, that is something that we're very much working on now. It's something that we want to take to the States for a political decision fairly soon. And yeah, and it's as ever with these kind of things, it's getting the balance between the level of detail that some require. In other words, some people's expectations for strategy actually is quite detailed. It's really what amounts to plans or projects, and others are happy to operate at a higher level. So I think that's a challenge really in terms of how we set out what the road looks like. But no, I think it's a fair question. But again, being honest, we've not got to that level yet.
But it's on the way.
It's on the way. Has to be. Yeah.
Question from Barry: do you believe there are different types? Oh, this is a good question for a leader. There are different types of leaders suit different types of crisis. You sometimes need the forceful, simplistic leaders. He cites Johnson and Trump for that, or sometimes he doesn't cite the others. Do you need thoughtful, consensus-building leadership for more complex issues? So, different leaders, different types of crisis.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think it's probably almost inevitable that and again, from a business perspective, that the person who's in a position to turn a company around is not necessarily the same person who will run the business successfully for the next 10 years. And I think it is probably the same in crisis management as well, whether it's in government or in business, that there are the immediate responses that are required perhaps may require a different mindset to those that are thinking going back to your point about developing a strategic roadmap for the next 10 years is not necessarily, you don't necessarily have the same skill set for those that are required to make decisions in the next 6 hours.
No, it's horses for courses. Andrew sent one in. It's a pleasure to listen to positive views being expressed from post-crisis. Speed is certainly of the essence before inertia sets in.
Yep.
We have great examples of how the island's changed after liberation. He said, are we considering the lessons being learned? You probably missed the earlier answer that you gave on this. Is there a case for the islands to actively cooperate in planning future similar global threats? Are we too small to work alone? Are we better and safer separately or working together?
Yeah, I mean, of course, pretty well on all external threats. Sorry about the clock's about to strike. It's a few minutes fast, so it's giving you due warning, Murray.
Your 5-minute warning.
I need to reset it. I mean, on external threats, I think again, Guernsey and Jersey's joint working and joint leadership, I think again has been exemplary. Really, in the 7-8 years I've been involved in government, I can't fault it. I think whether it's dealing with the EU, whether it's dealing with beneficial ownership, any of those issues, I don't think I can really fault it. So I certainly hope that continues. But in terms of whether it's fit for dealing with other global threats, whether that's climate change or other areas, I think my view is there's always great opportunity for doing more. So yeah, I would never shut the door at trying to take that opportunity.
You're going to certainly have the chance. Brexit's going to rear its ugly head again at any moment now, and we're going to start talking tariffs on our next one. In hindsight, is there anything that you would do differently over the last 8-10 weeks? Are there things that you've gone, done it, should have done that?
Yeah. I think no big calls. I don't think there are any big judgment calls where I think no, we made a mistake there, and if I was going around again, would we do it? I think it's probably more nuanced. I think it's probably about the timing. If we had known how this was going to unfold regionally, globally, then would we have moved earlier, a week earlier, 2 weeks earlier? And what consequences would that have had in terms of therefore enabling us to come out even quicker? Possibly. Similarly, I think it's probably only in 6 months will we be able to look back and say, were we too cautious in moving in the exit phases? And so I think the only honest answer I can give to that is, of course, the question is importantly premised with hindsight. because it's only with hindsight that you can really have a greater clarity on these things. But I think big calls I think are right, but probably a few days either way I might have done something slightly different, and indeed we may still have that view later on.
There's still a long way to go in this yet, and I think there is a danger of us all talking about the fact we're over this. And I watched your press conference today at 1 o'clock, and I thought that you kept reminding people we're not out of this yet, and there is still caution needed. Is it more difficult coming out of this and holding people back than it was trying to keep people in one place at one time?
Yeah, undoubtedly. I think coming out at the time it felt like it was a momentous decision to shut the entire island and economy down in one fell swoop. But it is only, again, with hindsight, the realization that actually it is much harder unwinding because it ceases to be black and white and everything becomes shades of grey, and drawing the lines between some of those decisions is quite hard. So it's
tough now. Jennifer, anything remaining from you? We're down to the last 3 minutes.
No, I think just the things that I've taken away here, listening to you talk, Gavin: consult widely, communicate, and the thing that you've done is to use the same team, use the people that know the answers essentially to communicate. Sometimes governments do that through spokespeople, but you've got the guys that are in the thick of it. And I think for me, from a leadership point of view through a crisis, one of the key attributes for leaders who do well is humility. And I think you have shown us that in spades in terms of the way that you've handled the crisis, and also the answers, the really human kind of answers that you've given today. And so thank you very much. We realise how really busy you are, and to take an hour out of your schedule to come and talk to us, we greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
No, delighted to do so. But I think picking up your point there about communication, I do think the essence of in summarising the essence of any leadership response to crisis, I think communication is probably the single thing that I would draw out. You can't over communicate, using it. And I think one of the things that we've sought to do is to not only be consistent, as I said earlier, but also use lots of different channels, recognizing that you have to find different ways to reach different people, and recognizing that again you're addressing people who have quite varied concerns depending on where they are on the spectrum. So and acknowledging that for them as well, that almost educating people is the classic thing, that if you're sitting in your social media bubble, you think that your view is the one that everybody else has. So if you happen to believe that government is being ridiculously overcautious and should just open up the borders tomorrow, actually you need to educate people that actually there's a good chunk of the population that have a completely different view. And I think that's that is it's not so much consultation at that point. It almost becomes a matter of using communication to educate people that there are a range of views that need to be reflected in the decision making. So yeah, in a single word, crisis management is about communication.
Tell you what, you could be a broadcaster. You talk bang up to time, 5 o'clock. That's a skill that not many have. Jennifer Carnegie, President of the Chamber of Commerce, thank you for joining us. Gavin, Chief Minister of Guernsey, thank you for your honesty and for your accessibility. We really appreciate the last hour. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Delighted to see you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone else who's joined us online here. This has been the Chamber Web Chat. We'll be back next Friday with another. And of course, you can find everything at jerseychamber.com. And thanks to Grant Thornton for sponsoring us. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye now.